truth. And the first U.S. law that was adopted, actually adopted to protect whistleblowers, was in the Civil War, 1863. But that was mostly to protect the government from being cheated by all these fraudulent billings for, during the war from the war machine profiteers, which has that changed?
What happened?
No, not really. Pardon?
What happened? I've never seen it enforced.
I know. But anyway, it's just another one of those laws on the books, right? So many whistleblowers in the last 100 years have become really household names for us. And for those that were involved in the peace movement, Smedley Butler, who was a general who outed a corporatist business plan to have a coup d'etat against FDR. He also wrote a book called, I'm forgetting it now.
War is a Racket.
That's right, War is a Racket. Thank you. War is a Racket. Because he was a general, he was very well respected in the 1930s, everybody knew him, he was a big hero, and he came out and said that war was about money. The same thing that Plato said 2,000 years before, but anyway, he said war is about money, and that the corporatists on their profiteering is the reason wars were so common. And then, of course, we jump to the 70s, and we all know Daniel Ellsberg, right? And we know Deep Throat, it was Mark Felt who outed the Watergate illegal actions. And then we have Karen Silkwood, who's concerned over worker safety. Frank Serpico, he revealed all the corruption in the NYPD. Once again, have things changed? I don't know. But these people are our heroes, and they brought it to the fore, and they made us aware. We have Mordecai Vanunu, who spent 17 years in an Israeli prison for revealing that, yes, in fact, Israel did have a nuclear weapons program. And of course, most recently, we have Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, William Thompson, who's a research scientist at the CDC, who is whistleblowing on the fact that the CDC shreds research that doesn't fit in with what they'd like us to know about medications and vaccines in particular. And we have Wendell Potter, of course. He was the public policy director for Cigna, as Michael was the public policy director for Blue Shield. Recently, of course, the Panama Papers. That's an anonymous whistleblower. And it's interesting that the whistleblowers tend not to be from the government agencies that are supposed to find these things out for us and protect us and regulate. And somehow that doesn't happen. The European Court of Human Rights ruled in 2008 that whistleblowing is a human right, and it's protected as a freedom of expression. But of course, the United States, we're a little bit behind, but I'm hoping that we are with it enough that we can protect people like Michael Johnson. So one of the reasons that government agencies are not discovering these breaches of public trust, and individuals are, is because the agencies oftentimes are in collusion themselves.
No.
Yes, with the corruption and are part of the problem. So the individuals face not only pressure from from the agencies, whatever private or corporate entity they've outed, they've exposed, but also the government agencies that are then, of course, secondarily revealed to have not done their job and have possibly benefited in some way from whatever fraudulent behavior was identified. So aside from the miscreants like the tobacco company, the pharmacies company, the banks, all those scandals, they've also involved the EPA, the NRC, the CDC, the Pentagon, the National Security Association, the CIA, the LAPD, the FBI, the SEC, the FDA, the Olympic Committee, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Defense, and it goes on and on and on, all the alphabet soup organizations. So essential to safeguarding our rights as individuals and safeguarding our right to expose criminality in all of its forms is, I think, supporting and honoring and, what's the word I want to say? Supporting, honoring, and giving our whistleblowers a platform, where they can share what they know. And that's what this is about, and that's why we're having Michael Johnson film today, because we want this to go beyond this room, far beyond this room. So For those of you that haven't looked at his website yet, and it's on the agenda, Make It Right Blue Shield, and I've also sent it out online. I highly recommend you go and read Michael's blogs. He's got about 30 blogs that are pretty amazing and really root out a lot of the problems that exist in an insurance corporation like Blue Shield, or company like Blue Shield. I doubt that the others are much different, probably worse in some ways and better in others. So anyway, do go online. He has a petition to sign. I think it's important we support the petition. I hope you think that too. If you go online, you read what he's written. And anyway, we are welcoming Michael Johnson. He's a Blue Shield whistleblower, and he wants us to make it right Blue Shield. Highly recommend everyone go to his website, which is makeitlightblueshield.org, and read his many, many blogs that are really amazing information and very, very important for us to know, I think. Michael Johnson is the former director of public policy at Blue Shield, California for 12 years. And prior to working at Blue Shield, Michael served as public affairs and communications consultant, which included work on numerous California ballot initiatives, campaigns. He also served briefly in state government as an external affairs officer for the California Department of Insurance. After graduating from Harvard in 1986, Michael spent several years working for consumer advocacy groups. Mr. Johnson resigned his job a year ago as Blue Shield Director of Public Policy in protest of a plan by senior executives to privatize billions of dollars in community assets. He's currently, since then, he's been fighting in the media and before regulators, and also telling us, the public, about the situation in order to stop them. He's currently waging a campaign to force the nonprofit health plan to provide greater community benefit. In court, Michael is fending off a Blue Shield lawsuit against him. He's going to tell us about his battle with Blue Shield, what's at stake for the public, and steps that activists can take to help force the big nonprofit insurers to act for the benefit of the public rather than their own executives. So let's warmly welcome Michael Johnson.
Thank you all for coming, and Maureen, thank you very much for that history of whistleblowing. That wasn't something I was aware of. So I hope that I fare better than some of those people, particularly the dead people. But so it's been a little over a year now since I left Blue Shield, resigned from Blue Shield, and went public with my concerns, started down this path of being a whistleblower. And so, I've been reflecting on that experience, in particular, asking myself, was this worth it? What have I been able to accomplish? And I have to say that for the last 6 months, I've had a lot of doubts about that, because during that period, I've been on the receiving end of a very aggressive lawsuit by Blue Shield. And that's not been a pleasant experience at all, not to mention the tens of thousands of dollars that I've already run up in legal expenses, not fun for my wife Betsy either. So the lawsuit is ongoing, and knowing Blue Shield's lawyers, I'm sure they're going to be looking at this videotape, and so I'm going to be very careful about what I say about that lawsuit. But I do want to say just this, and that is that while it has enraged me, and that's not been fun, it has made me more determined than ever to accomplish what I set out to accomplish when I left Blue Shield, and that is to stop them from ripping off the public. And so that's what I want to talk with you about, is this scheme, this effort by Blue Shield to privatize literally billions of dollars in assets, in money that belongs to the public. So in many ways, what I want to talk to you about isn't so much about, it's not really about the healthcare system, but rather about this sort of abuse that you hear Bernie Sanders talking about. It's about people in the private sphere, elites in the private world, taking from the public what belongs to the public and not to them. So let me start first with an explanation about what Blue Cross Blue Shield is, because that's confusing to a lot of people. So back in the 1930s and 40s, these Blue Cross Blue Shield plans got started. Blue Cross plans were started, health insurance plans were started as insurance for hospital bills. I mean, insurance didn't exist before then. This was a novel concept. Blue Shield plans were coverage for physician bills. And these entities were set up all across the country. The plans were set up as nonprofits. And as nonprofits, that means that they were not set up to generate profit for any investors or other private individuals. They were set up to serve community needs, to serve the public interest. And in recognition of the fact that they were benefiting the public, these nonprofits were provided with tax exemptions. So in many states, these Blue Cross Blue Shield plans combined, and that's why most people kind of get confused about our situation here in California, where we actually, the two plans didn't combine. You've got a Blue Cross plan and you've got a Blue Shield plan. They're separate. Both of the plans have expanded their operations so that they now provide insurance coverage for both, obviously, hospital services as well as physician services. But in California, Blue Cross and Blue Shield are separate. The Blue Cross and Blue Shield plans all belong to the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, which licenses the Blue Cross Blue Shield name. But the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association isn't one big conglomerate. These plans, for the most part, are all totally independent of each other. And Blue Shield of California, which was the Blue Shield plan, the plan that I worked for, is a completely separate entity from any of the other Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. So it's its own corporation, nonprofit corporation. So now fast forward to the 1980s, 1990s, and we had then a number of these plans being sold. These nonprofit Blue Cross Blue Shield plans were being sold to for-profit companies. And when that happened, for the most part, especially in states like California that have strong consumer protections, the proceeds from the sales of these nonprofit health plans had to go to the public, right? And typically they would go to the public in the form of the proceeds would go to a public benefit foundation of some sort that would serve community healthcare needs in some way. In some states, some of the money went to the state government in order to help fund the state Medicaid programs. But the idea there was that these nonprofit health plans essentially belong to the public. And if they're going to be taken private, if they're going to be purchased by a for-profit company, the public has to be compensated for that, because these plans are no longer going to be serving the community benefit. They're going to be now serving private investors. So the sale of these nonprofit plans, the proceeds from the sale of these nonprofit plans needed to go to the public. And this is exactly what happened in California with Blue Cross of California back in 1994. Blue Cross, like Blue Shield, was a nonprofit health plan. Blue Cross was purchased at the time by WellPoint, which has since is now known as Anthem. When WellPoint purchased Blue Cross for $3 billion, the Department of Corporations which then regulated health plans in California, required that that $3 billion go to the public in the form of grants to establish the California Endowment. So some of you may be familiar with that organization. These are public benefit foundations, the California Endowment and the California Healthcare Foundation. And these are completely separate and independent of Blue Cross. Blue Cross's management, its board, had no role in the governance of these two, widely respected public benefit foundations that provide grants to community clinics and fund all sorts of community-related healthcare activities. So that happened in 1994. Now, in 1995, a year later, in order to provide extra protection against any kind of insider dealing on the part of managers of nonprofit health plans, any effort by insiders to try and basically skim off in some way or another the assets of those nonprofit plans, the legislature passed a law that that provided that, very explicitly, that if a nonprofit health plan is purchased by a for-profit company or otherwise converts to for-profit status, that the proceeds from the sale or that an amount equivalent to the value of the assets of the nonprofit health plan when the conversion happens get transferred to the public into a public benefit foundation or a conversion foundation as a way of, again, assuring that the public continues to get value from this nonprofit health plan that the public effectively owns. So the legislature writes that into law. That's called Article 11 of the Knox-Keene Act. As soon as the legislature began considering the law, Blue Shield started scheming to evade it. So, first, a month after the bill was introduced, Blue Shield's board of directors changes the corporate status of Blue Shield, reincorporates Blue Shield from a general nonprofit corporation to what's called a mutual benefit nonprofit corporation. And then they go to the legislature and they lobby for an amendment to that law that was just passed that exempts mutual benefit nonprofit corporations, health plans that are organized as mutual benefit nonprofits. Now, the difference between a mutual benefit corporation and other nonprofit corporations in California is that mutual benefits are organized for the mutual benefit of their members. These are homeowners associations, trade associations, a country club, where the purpose of the nonprofit is to benefit the members of the nonprofit, not to benefit the public at large. So the other types of nonprofits that you have, excluding religious corporations, but the other types of nonprofits like hospitals, for example, other nonprofit health plans, the Sierra Club, your organization, I'm sure, are what are called public benefit corporations. They're organized for the benefit of the public at large. And again, this is the designation that Blue Cross of California had before it converted to for-profit status. That's what Kaiser Permanente is, and every single nonprofit hospital in California is organized as a public benefit corporation. So Blue Shield, in its kind of effort to try and evade this law, reincorporates itself as a mutual benefit corporation, but as a very strange sort of mutual benefit corporation, because it writes into its bylaws that the corporation has no members. So that the people who are enrollees of the corporation, which, and I don't know if any of you are Blue Shield members, but you get a card, it says member ID. Blue Shield calls them members, but for purposes of legal purposes, those members are not members of the corporation. They have no ownership interest in Blue Shield. They have no voting rights, no ability, influence over who gets to run Blue Shield. They have no special rights to records of the company. They have none of the rights and privileges that members of mutual benefit corporations have. Fortunately, the legislature kind of doesn't fall for this, isn't taken in by Blue Shield. And so when Blue Shield goes to the legislature and says, let's exempt nonprofit mutual benefit corporations from this law that is intended to make sure that the assets of nonprofit health plans actually go to benefit the public, the legislature says, not so fast. We will exempt nonprofit mutual benefit corporations, but only to the extent that the mutual benefit corporation is not holding assets in charitable trusts. Okay, now that's a very important concept. So what a charitable trust obligation means, and this is a function of the common law rather than statutory law, so it's not actually written into the law. It's something handed down from English common law and has been developed in case law here in California. But what the charitable trust obligation means is that if you're a nonprofit organization and you have as your declared mission that you're going to be doing public good, and that's what you're telling the public, and you go out there and you solicit contributions, or you sell products, such as you sell raffle tickets, or if you sell health insurance. But if in any way you're taking in money, you're a nonprofit organization, you're taking in money, you're promising to do good, then that money that you've taken in is held in trust for the good of the community. Okay, you have a legal obligation to make sure that that money is spent for the benefit of the community. That's a charitable trust obligation. So it was absolutely critical that the legislature made sure that effectively Article 11, this law protecting the assets of nonprofit healthcare corporations, making sure they go to the benefit of the public. Very important the legislature said any nonprofit corporation that has a charitable trust obligation is subject to this law. Okay, so that was 1995. Legislature enacts that law. When I came to work for Blue Shield, I didn't know anything about any of this stuff. And, this wasn't something I heard anybody talking about Blue Shield's corporate nonprofit status. There was a lot of talk, of course, about Blue Shield. We're a nonprofit. We're all about doing good for the community. And hey, consumers, you should buy Blue Shield insurance instead of Blue Cross or Aetna because we're a nonprofit and we care about the community and they don't, and all that sort of stuff. But when I discovered and learned at Blue Shield that Blue Shield was organized as a mutual benefit corporation rather than a public benefit corporation as Kaiser was and all the nonprofit hospitals, that raised questions in my mind about whether maybe Blue Shield was doing something to evade its responsibilities to the public. And so I started looking into it. And what I discovered, what I learned, is that setting yourself up as a mutual benefit corporation, especially in this strange way that Blue Shield did, that's actually an excellent way to evade accountability to the public. And if you are a group of corporate executives and you want to be able to operate a multi-billion-dollar corporation without any accountability to anybody, this is the perfect setup, right? I mean, a public company has got obligations to its shareholders, has to report to the SEC, all that sort of stuff. Most nonprofits, like a public benefit corporation that has a clear legal duty to benefit the public, those are overseen by the Attorney General. They have all sorts of reporting obligations. They have to disclose, publicly disclose how they're governed, their bylaws. They have to provide detailed disclosure of executive compensation, but not a mutual benefit corporation that has no members. And because this mutual benefit corporation has no members, that means that the CEO and his 11 fellow board members have the ability to run this organization without any accountability to anybody. So this is it's a great deal for the executives running it. But to me, and when I went to work for Blue Shield, the fact that Blue Shield was a nonprofit was very, very important to me. I mean, I really, that meant something to me, and I needed that. I needed Blue Shield to be true to that. And so I found all of this very troubling, the way that Blue Shield was structured. I also found troubling the fact that Blue Shield didn't really seem to be doing very much to benefit the public. And by that I mean, I sort of asked myself, well, what does it mean as a nonprofit healthcare organization to be operating for the benefit of the public? To me, that means you've got to be doing something that the for-profit companies aren't doing. Because if what you're doing is exactly what a for-profit company is doing, then where's the benefit to the public? Why should the taxpayers be subsidizing you if they can get exactly what they're getting from you, which are products and services at essentially the same price that the for-profit companies are providing? There's no benefit to the public. So the benefit, in my view, that Blue Shield was providing was limited essentially to the charitable contributions that it was making. And Blue Shield has a charitable foundation, the Blue Shield of California Foundation, that does some good work. But it's making contributions on the order of about $30, maybe $40 million a year. Blue Shield is worth probably $10 billion. If you sold Blue Shield, that's how much you could get for Blue Shield. So what you're looking at here, as far as the public is concerned, the public owns this $10 billion asset, and the return it's getting on it every year is $30 to $40 million. Okay, that is about a third of a percent. And any investment manager would tell you that's a pretty lousy deal. So I thought the way Blue Shield was organized seemed to me to be for the purpose of evading any kind of accountability for a public benefit mission. I didn't think Blue Shield was providing the sort of benefit to the public that a nonprofit ought to provide. And so eventually, I raised these concerns with the CEO. And the CEO told me to go pound sand. I mean, he utterly dismissed the idea that there was any kind of a problem, that there was any need for any change at all. And so I resigned. And when I resigned, the first thing that I did was I went to the Los Angeles Times, and I pointed them to some information that led the Los Angeles Times to discover that Blue Shield's state tax exemption had been revoked, and that actually the state had revoked Blue Shield's tax exemption the previous year, but had not reported it. Blue Shield had not disclosed it. So I helped the LA Times report that. And when the LA Times reported that, this was in April of last year, it was big headlines, made news even nationally, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. This is really drawing attention to this problem in the way that I'm sure every whistleblower dreams of doing, and people are really going to do something about this. You even had Senator Hernandez, who is the chair of the Senate Health Committee, was quoted in that Los Angeles Times article saying, and I found this very encouraging, Blue Shield enrollees and the public at large are entitled to a reasonable return on the investment the state has made by granting Blue Shield tax-exempt status. I'm looking forward to finding out exactly what the public got for our money. So I'm thinking, great, we're going to see some real change here. But turns out that the revocation of the tax exemption actually confused a lot of people, and it led a lot of people to think, oh, terrific, the problem's been solved. But all the revocation means is that Blue Shield is now going to have to start paying income taxes. And that'll probably be on the order of about $30 million a year. So Blue Shield is now going to have to start paying $30 million a year in taxes. Okay, that's good. But what about the $10 billion that they're sitting on, right? That $10 billion that really belongs to the public. I mean, the tax authorities and their revocation of Blue Shield's tax exemption does nothing to force Blue Shield to treat that $10 billion like it belongs to the public and use the $10 billion to provide real benefit to the public. So the tax authorities don't have any authority to do anything about that, but the Department of Managed Healthcare does. And the Department of Managed Healthcare is the agency in California state government that regulates health plans. And when it comes to nonprofit health plans, it actually has quite a bit of authority. So the DMHC has the authority to do something about this, and at the time when I left Blue Shield, I thought, wow, you know what, there's a golden opportunity here to get the DMHC to move on this, because at the time, Blue Shield was in the midst of, had just made a deal to acquire another health plan for $1.2 billion, a smaller health plan, and that deal needed to be approved by the Department of Managed Healthcare. So here Blue Shield was going to have to go and get the department's approval. I, immediately after leaving, wrote a letter to the DMHC saying, look, there needs to be a public hearing on this deal, and that the department needs to make sure that the deal, that the $1.2 billion of the public's money, because it's not Blue Shield's money, it all belongs to the public, that that money is going to be spent in a way that is going to benefit the public. And that the DMHC needs to make sure that Blue Shield is otherwise acting properly as a nonprofit should and providing real benefit to the public. And in kind of writing this letter, I pointed to Article 11, right? That was the law that the legislature passed in 1995, which had provisions in it that applied not just to situations where a nonprofit health plan gets sold to a for-profit plan or converts to a for-profit, but also has provisions that deal with what happens when a nonprofit health plan wants to spend a big chunk of money on an acquisition, because the law wants to make sure that that this money that belongs to the public is being spent for public benefit. So anyway, so I make this argument that this needs to happen. I'm not the only one. A whole coalition of consumer groups makes the same argument. Consumers Union, some of you may be familiar with them. They're the publisher of Consumer Reports magazine, made some very, very strong arguments to the DMHC about the need to apply Article 11 and the protections of Article 11 to the deal. So in response to that, Blue Shield says, oh, Article 11 doesn't apply to Blue Shield because we're a mutual benefit corporation, and they say, and our assets are not subject to a charitable trust obligation. We're not that kind of nonprofit. We're not a charity. We're not like these nonprofit hospitals. We're not like Kaiser. We're not like Blue Cross was. Instead, what they say is, you should think of us more like, and I kid you not, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Or the Olympic Club. The Olympic Club is this Tony San Francisco social club. They say, That's how you should look at us, as those organizations which clearly don't have any obligation to do anything for the public. We're that kind of an organization. Okay, so I'm thinking, great, you know, there's no question the DMHC is going to come down on Blue Shield and say, you're out of your minds, you're a nonprofit, and you need to start acting like a nonprofit. So, feeling good about myself, I go off on a vacation, I'm kayaking, you know, Catalina Islands, and while I'm gone, the DMHC makes a decision. They approve the acquisition, and in approving the acquisition, which happened very quickly, I wasn't expecting it to happen because I was expecting all these protections and scrutiny to be applied that was required under Article 11. But the DMHC doesn't apply Article 11 to the transaction, and when the LA Times asks them why not, the director says, well, I agreed with Blue Shield, that Blue Shield doesn't have a charitable trust obligation. Okay, so now that's a huge deal. I mean, that is a monumental determination on the part of the DMHC, because what that ruling means, what she's saying is that $10 billion we're talking about doesn't belong to the public. That belongs to Blue Shield, to its board, to do with what it pleases. And that Blue Shield, and this is the legal meaning of that determination, has no obligation to do anything for the public. Has no obligation as a nonprofit to work for the benefit of the community. And if Blue Shield's directors decide to sell themselves to Aetna, decide to sell Blue Shield to a for-profit company, and Aetna pays, and it would be something on the order of $10 billion. That's a good, reasonable estimate of what Blue Shield is worth. That $10 billion wouldn't go into a public benefit foundation, nothing like the California Endowment, California Healthcare Foundation. It would go to those 11 people who run Blue Shield, and they could decide what they wanted to do with it. And it's not clear to me under the law that they couldn't just stick that into their own pockets. So in short, this ruling by the DMHC that Blue Shield doesn't have a charitable trust obligation amounted to giving away $10 billion of the public's money. So you would think, okay, this is a big deal, right? You know, what, I mean, they must have had some justification for it. What did they say? Nothing. The DMHC to this day has offered no public explanation for how they came to that decision, have no discussion of their rationale for that decision. Aghast about this, I submitted a Public Records Act request for any records, documents, internal communications, external communications, anything that would shed any light on how the DMHC came to its decision. And I was told, no, we're not going to show you anything, no documents. So what do we do now? Well, what we've got to do, I mean, what's critical here, of course, is to get the DMHC decision reversed, because if we don't do that, $10 billion that would otherwise go to serving community healthcare needs will instead go into private hands. If we don't get that DMHC determination that Blue Shield doesn't have a charitable trust obligation reversed. And so in order to get that reversed, obviously the first step in doing that is to expose this, because I'm sure this is the first time you're all hearing about this. This isn't something that the news media has been covering to a great extent. This is complicated stuff. It's difficult. It's difficult to understand, but there is an enormous amount at stake here. And I think that if we can get reporters and we can get legislators to understand what this DMHC ruling means, the consequences of it, what it means for the public and the loss of the $10 billion, we can get them to understand that. and understand that the DMHC has no justification for it that they're willing to share with the public, I think then, that will start the ball rolling. And that, and that if that doesn't put sufficient pressure on the DMHC to overturn the decision, to reverse the decision, that the legislature can step in. So as Maureen mentioned, on my website, I've got, among those blogs, you don't have to read 30 blog posts. There are just a couple of blog posts that are specifically about this DMHC decision, what it means, what's at stake for the public, what the DMHC hasn't been willing to say about it. Take a look at those. There's also a petition to the DMHC demanding that they disclose the rationale for the decision. And then, so take a look at that, sign the petition, and then share all of this stuff with your friends. And, let's get the word out about this, because, in the end, whether or not my adventure in whistleblowing here, which has not been a particularly pleasant one today, but whether it amounts to anything or ends up being worthwhile really depends on what activists like you do with the information that I'm bringing forth. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.
If anybody has a question, could you use the mic, because it will help the videographers? And I would just like to say that everything you've told us reminds me of that old adage that the best way to rob a bank is to own one, right?
Yeah, well,
We've seen that.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Panama Papers situation, all the discussion of that, kind of rings true, because this is like what Blue Shield has got going here. I mean, for all of it's like an offshore account that nobody knows about. There's no accountability around it. The media isn't tracking it. I mean, they're operating kind of in the dark here almost. Yeah.
Hi, I have a lot of questions, but I have to first start with, how in the world were they even allowed to accumulate that much money without giving it to the public all along? Shouldn't there have been laws governing that? I know I'm a healthcare provider, and I see it all. And it seems to me that if they were nonprofit, the first thing they should have been doing was offering health insurance for a much lower cost, of which they were not ever doing. How did they accumulate so much? I mean, tell me how their little charitable organizations were helping the public. I haven't heard about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the charitable organization makes grants to some community clinics. It gives out about, like something close to $30 million a year. But again, that's a drop in the bucket when you consider the billions of dollars. I mean, Blue Shield takes in, its annual revenues are something on the order of, I think, $12 billion a year. That's how much it's taking in premiums. Now, in terms of the money that it's accumulated, so $10 billion is what the whole organization is worth.
Mm-hmm.
They're sitting on $4 billion in cash. Okay, so $4 billion represents their accumulated profit over the years, that is socked away. And a lot of people, including Consumers Union, have made the argument that it is totally inappropriate especially for a nonprofit organization, to be socking away those kinds of profits, and that money should be used to reduce rates. And Blue Shield has refused to do that. There's no law in California that requires them to do that, and the regulators don't really have the authority to force them to do that either. And so Blue Shield has used, they just recently used $1 billion of that money to go buy another health plan, which is great for the executives, right? Because they get to build their empire, And I was saying, well, wait a minute, you know, to the DMHC, you should make sure that this isn't just an exercise in empire building by the executives, and that this is something that is really going to benefit the public, that it makes sense for Care First, which was this Medi-Cal plan here in California, that there's real value to the public in having that be combined with Blue Shield and make Blue Shield prove that there is that value. And they said, no, Blue Shield, it's not that kind of a nonprofit. It's like the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences doesn't have an obligation to show that this would benefit the public.
Okay, but if they lost their tax exempt status, and that's because of what they've been doing all along, doesn't that mean let's go backwards and they owe a lot of tax?
Well, there's the tax authorities, and I have to be careful about what I say here, and so I probably shouldn't say anything, but I'll just say generally that, you know, there's a limit to how far back the tax authorities can go. I mean, it's like with any taxpayer, if they ding you for, you know, something, they can only go back a certain number of years, and that's true of a big corporate taxpayer like Blue Shield. But even so, again, and this is a really important point that I've had that I think it's hard for a lot of people to understand, that the tax exemption, it's not, even if they went back, let's say, you know, Blue Shield is, their taxes now are probably about $30 million a year, something like that. So if you went back 10 years, that's $300 million, and probably a little less even because their income was a little lower. You know, going back 10 years, you go back 20 years and say, maybe it's $500 million, 30 years, and now we're talking, I don't know, $700, $600 million, but compared to the $10 billion, I mean, that's what really matters. That what the critical point here is that it's a nonprofit. It's not owned by anybody, right? It's not, and the deal that they made when they were created was, we're going to do good for the public, and in exchange for that, we get a tax exemption. Well, their obligation to do good for the public continues, even if their obligation to do good for the public continues, even if they stop doing good for the public. Even if the tax authorities say, you know what, we're gonna revoke your tax exemption because you're not doing good for the public, that doesn't then give them the right to say, okay, terrific, we'll take that $10 million and we'll just use it for our own benefit. That $10 billion still belongs to the public, you know, that because they're not doing what they should be doing with that $10 billion, they're having to pay taxes, but far more important to us, to the public, is that $10 billion go to benefit the public. And that's what this is all about. This is all about, you know, making sure that they don't make off, you know, sell Blue Shield, they don't, and then pocket the proceeds from that sale.
Good.
How much of that $10 billion was accumulated before they got this non-exempt status? I mean, that money should have been actually taken away from them at that time, because say, well, this goes to the public, then you're on your own from now on.
I mean, I think what you're saying is that when they had the tax exemption revoked, they basically, all of the profits that they had accumulated up until that point should have been taken from them, because the idea, because it's almost like they had converted to for-profit status, because the state was saying, you're no longer serving the public, so we need to take that money, and we need to apply that. Well, you know, that might be a good subject for legislation. It's not the law today, and that's the problem here. Is that you know, this is sort of a complicated area of law. There are not a lot of entities of this sort, so the law doesn't adequately address that situation. All the law says is your tax exemption has been revoked. But again, there is the law of charitable trusts, right? So Blue Shield is still subject to that. I think it's just absolutely clear that DMHC made the wrong decision there. Why they made it, I don't know. You know, they won't say. But if the DMHC had said, yeah, of course, Blue Shield is a nonprofit. It's not anything like the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences or like a social club. It's like Blue Cross was when Blue Cross converted to for-profit status. It's like Kaiser. If they had said that, which seemed like, and all the consumer groups were saying that's the case, if that were the case, then Blue Shield would be under an obligation to serve the public. It would be clear that they have that legal duty. There would be no potential that they could sell themselves and run off with that $10 billion. That $10 billion, in the event of a sale, would go to a public benefit foundation. And I think with the DMHC having made that declaration that they're a nonprofit and have with obligations to the public, there would have been an opportunity to say, and by the way, DMHC, for the consumer groups, to say, you need to start to spell that out a little better. We need tighter regulation of nonprofits.
Well, I think another thing that should be done is all the officials for the DMHC should have their savings and banking accounts checked for any increases, marked increases, or any purchases of homes and boats and things like that that they've made since this decision came down.
I have to say, as cynical as I am now about what goes on and about the influence that Blue Shield wields in these circles, I don't think anybody was outright bribed to make this decision. But I don't. But I think that, Blue Shield, here's kind of another, Blue Shield makes lots of campaign contributions. Blue Shield's foundation makes lots of grants all over the place. Those grants buy Blue Shield all kinds of influence and a lot of friends. There are a lot of people in state government that are grateful. But I don't think they're bribing individual officials in that
That's why
legal
we have so
sort
many
of way.
offshore banking accounts.
It's the usual legal sort of bribery that's taking place. The campaign contributions, the giving money to a public official's favorite charity, that kind of stuff.
But that money, that $10 billion, that's invested somewhere, right?
Well, again, the $10 billion represents, that's the total value of Blue Shield.
But you said they had $4 billion cash.
They have $4 billion in cash.
That's not just sitting in a safe somewhere, that's invested, right?
It's invested.
So if they're invested in something that's actually doing harm somewhere in the world, like supporting warmongers and that sort of thing, we should be able to say, you stop that. You're doing harm here, and you're supposed to be doing good for the public, and you're invested in something that's doing harm, even to petroleum companies that are tearing down our environment and all that. We can force them to invest that money in something that would be more beneficial.
I think you're absolutely right, that as a nonprofit, and that the public should have a right to know what investments they're making and be able to raise objections.
Okay.
But the public doesn't know. Blue Shield doesn't have to disclose. They don't have to disclose, or they're not fully disclosing the executive compensation that they pay. They're certainly not disclosing kind of the individual investments that they're making. So we don't know what they're doing with that money.
Do you know who at the DMC has made this decision?
Yeah, it's the director of the DMHC is Shelley Rouillard.
Okay, have you talked directly to any legislators who in fact might be able to then demand from that person the reason for that decision?
Not yet, because I think before there's any likelihood that legislators would be receptive to that, there needs to be more of a public outcry. And that's why, really, I think it's, go onto my website, sign that petition, You know, we need to make some serious noise about this before legislators will care.
Okay, thank you.
I was gonna ask the question, if you were working with the legislators, our very unfortunate experience with trying to get help, we learned that one of the ways that the legislators get around actually having to do anything useful is by pointing at each other. Oh, don't come to me with your healthcare stuff. Henry Waxman, he's the healthcare guy. So then only Henry Waxman has to dodge people who are trying to get help with healthcare. Do you have any idea who in the California legislature or in the US Congress fits that mold and could help you?
Again, I don't, look, if there were legislators that were willing to stick their necks out about, out on this, I would have heard from them, and I haven't. I mean, this was all over the LA Times when the tax exemption came out, when this acquisition was being reviewed by the Department of Managed Health Care. The debate about Blue Shield's charitable trust obligation was covered very well by the Los Angeles Times. And so people in the legislature, they saw what was going on, and nobody weighed in. I do think that the determination itself that Blue Shield didn't have a charitable trust obligation. There was an article, the LA Times wrote about it, but there hasn't been any coverage since. I just think that for legislators, it's something that's kind of, nobody's making a big stink about this. There's one whistleblower out there kind of mouthing off about it, but otherwise, there's no big public fuss about this, and so it's just not something that anybody's going to want to take on until they, legislators, and rightly so, tend to be responsive to the public and their constituents. They're responsive to their contributors as well, but in order for us to get their attention, we've got to show that this is something that the public cares about.
And finally, the whole concept you described of an organization created for the benefit of its members that has no members. Now, I can understand how a law could be written that would allow that to be legal, but it seems hard for me to understand how that could be functional. Because again, I think that governance of such an organization, the laws of the governance of the organization would be such that the members would have a voice, and that without members, there's no voice, governance should be impossible.
Well, no, the governance is the 11 board members. You basically have the board members who are, future board members are nominated by the existing board members and approved by the existing board members, and they don't, they're, like I say, they're not accountable to anybody but themselves, and it is there, I will guarantee you that there is not certainly another organization of Blue Shield size, a multi-billion-dollar organization that is as devoid of accountability as Blue Shield is. And I mean, to me, look, I scratched my head about this when I was working at Blue Shield. I raised this internally saying, Jesus, how can we live with ourselves? This just completely defies everything that we say about our commitment to the community and claims that we make about accountability and about transparency. And it's, again, it took me years and years to sort of figure this out on my own. It's complicated stuff. There are very few legislators that understand this, and so they have really been been pretty genius, the, folks at Blue Shield, at kind of maneuvering themselves into a crack in the law.
Well, again, you said this happened just a few years ago.
Well,
So by then, they were a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
Yeah.
They could afford some pretty good corporate lawyers. So I can
well,
understand how somebody could
like I
find
said,
a way
this-
to do that.
This has
but-
been going on for, over 20 years, right? So it was 20 years ago that they got this brilliant idea, hey, let's reestablish ourselves as a mutual benefit corporation. Because they were worried about this new law in the legislature that was gonna make sure that nonprofits couldn't abscond with the public's money. And they started maneuvering then to get out from under it. And they've effectively accomplished that, unless we can get, the next step is to then sell themselves, right? And I think that's, we're talking a few years off. And you can see that happening in the health plan industry right now, right? You've been reading about these big mergers that are happening. There's a lot of consolidation happening. A health plan of Blue Shield size is frankly gonna have difficulty competing against these much bigger health plans that can afford much more sophisticated IT systems. And so Blue Shield, I think, just as a result of the economics of healthcare, is gonna need to combine with a larger entity at some point. And that's going to mean a for-profit entity. And if we don't get this problem fixed, this decision reversed before then, the public's gonna lose out on $10 billion.
Thank you.
I really appreciated your introductory description of the basically different ways of organizing NGOs and their and different purposes. I think there's a lot of public confusion about that, and really needs to be broadcast more and developed more available to the general public. And also, your description of the way Blue Cross here in California was being privatized, what it reminded me of was the way enterprises were privatized in the former Soviet Union, which one economist characterizes pirate capitalism.
Yeah.
But what interests me when you, of course I completely agree with you about the need for public pressure, but the kind of question I have, because you were very concrete about everything else, is legally who regulates the regulators, and how specifically are they regulated? We have a system of checks and balances where we know that the president can appoint a Supreme Court justice with the advice and consent of the Senate, but then if that Supreme Court justice behaves in an unconstitutional way, they're subject to impeachment by the Congress. So the regulators are regulated, at least theoretically, in that system. And I'm wondering here how these regulators, the board here, what are the mechanisms for regulating it?
Well, the Director Riard, was appointed by Governor Brown, so
Okay.
she serves at Governor Brown's pleasure.
Uh-huh.
So the governor's office has
Ultimately,
the
yes.
governor's office has the final say on something
Uh-huh.
like this, and it's actually, the governor's Health and Human Services Secretary,
Uh-huh.
Diana
Yeah.
Dooley, is really effectively
The boss.
the boss of the DMHC's kind of boss.
So
And
it seems
the
that
decision-
that's where the pressure should be.
Yes,
then,
yeah, the pressure needs to be there as well. But I think, right now, just kind of, step one, I think, is to lay bare for all the world to see that the DMHC, what this decision means, the impact that it has on people, and the fact that the DMHC doesn't want to share whatever rationale it might have for it with the public. That's really suspicious. And I think once we kind of get that out there, I want to get that out there, and I'm working behind the scenes with reporters to get additional reporting on this that I expect will happen soon. And that'll put pressure on Governor Brown and Secretary Dooley. Won't look so good for them. Legislators will start asking questions. You know, ultimately, you know, I don't know whether this is something you could go to court and there could be some way of redressing it there. It may be that ultimately that's something that needs to happen. That would obviously take lots of money.
Yeah.
But I think for now, I just want to, let's make sure everybody understands what went down here and the fact that there's been no rationale offered by the regulators for what they did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, so much for focusing on this issue. But I have visited your website and seen that there are many issues, actually, that have to do with Blue Shield, which I think are really important for people to know about. And I hope everyone will go to your website, Make It Right Blue Shield, because there are 30 blogs and they're very interesting. I wondered if you could address one of those other topics. I don't know if you're at liberty to do so. And that is the one that deals with the fact that Blue Shield, as a nonprofit, made more profit than any other insurance corporation in the country under Obamacare. And that the ways that they made that profit, the fact that they were fined for making that amount of profit, and how they ended up paying for the fine. That I would love it if you would tell us all about that if you can.
You really have been reading those.
I have. Oh, there are some really interesting ones there too.
Linking 3 different.
Yes, but anyway, I think that's
Sure.
very important for people to know, because we have people right here and people who are going to be seeing this who are the non-member members of Blue Shield, and they might want to know something about that. Thank you.
So under Obamacare, there was a program under Obamacare that provided that for 2014, and 2014 was the first year that Obamacare took effect. And there was a lot of concern, and it was legitimate, that who really knew what was going to happen, because you were going to have all these new people coming into the insurance market, people who didn't have insurance before. It was going to be difficult for insurance companies to know how much to charge and to get the premiums right. And so one of the programs that Obamacare established to try and encourage insurance companies not to be too conservative, in other words, not to be so afraid that they were going to get stuck with sick people and set their premiums too high, was to say to them, at the end of 2014, we're going to see how much profit you made, what your losses were, and if you had excessive losses, those are going to be shared with the companies that had excessive profits, and we're going to kind of even things out. So there won't be any real huge downside to you if the premiums you set are too low and you have these losses, because this government program is going to reimburse you for most of those losses. And by the same token, if you set your premiums too high, the government is going to take most of that money and use that to share with the companies that had big losses. So that was this particular program that was in effect. Well, and you may have read some stories about a number of nonprofit cooperative plans that went under because when they started tallying up what happened in 2014, most insurance companies lost money. And there were very few insurance companies that made money, and so there wasn't nearly enough money to reimburse the companies that lost money, and the conservatives, the Republicans, were saying that the government couldn't spend any of its own money, and no money from any other source to reimburse those companies that lost money. And so a number of these small cooperatives went out of business. Okay, but that's sort of beside the point. when they did this analysis, well, who were the winners and who were the losers, they found that Blue Shield of California earned the highest profits off of Obamacare of any health insurance company in America in 2014, nonprofit Blue Shield of California. And so, so the government said, you know, they basically, they seized what, a good portion of that. And Maureen has read the blog more recently than I. She may remember the number, but it was something like,
$120 million.
okay, there we go. It was $120 million. $120 million they took from Blue Shield. Now, this gets a little complicated. There's also, under Obamacare, some of you may know about the medical loss ratio requirement, the rebate requirement. So insurance companies have to spend 80 cents on the dollar on medical care, and if they don't, they have to refund the difference to their customers. So Blue Shield owed a bunch because it had these very high profits in 2014, and that was because it had relatively low medical expenses compared to the premiums that it charged. That's why its profits were so high. So it owed a lot of rebates to people because of this huge gap between, its medical expenses and the premiums it took in. Well, that $120 million that it paid to the government, it counted that as medical expenses. So instead of reimbursing this, it counted it as, and reimbursed just that. So that $120 million excess profit tax was effectively paid by Blue Shield policyholders. So if you were a Blue Shield policyholder in 2014, some of your money went to go reimburse the losses of insurance companies in other states because Blue Shield made too much money. And I argued that, look, Blue Shield was the one that screwed up and charged too much. The policyholders lost out, right? Because this is what they paid, and these were the medical costs, and they should get that difference. The fact that there's this program that requires Blue Shield to share excess profits with the government, that should come out of Blue Shield's profits, out of that $4 billion they have stockpiled, not out of the pockets of their enrollees. Now, the third point in this is, well, how did Blue Shield make such big profits in 2014? Well, the reason this is a little harder. Okay, some of this is sort of speculation on my part. But what I did an analysis, and it showed that compared to like Blue Cross and other health plans, Blue Shield's premiums weren't really that much higher than those other health plans, but its medical expenses were significantly lower. Okay, so what did Blue, and by the way, when Blue Shield, there's also a report they had to submit to the government about how healthy or unhealthy their enrollees were, and there was a program that the government had to reimburse companies that had particularly unhealthy enrollees. And Blue Shield reported our enrollees were really unhealthy. And so Blue Shield got over $100 million, or I think it was close to $100 million from the government to reimburse it for all the unhealthy enrollees it had. But its medical expenses were so much lower than how could that be? Well, and there's a couple of class action lawsuits against Blue Shield over what happened in 2014, which is there was a complete meltdown. When the computer systems didn't work, they weren't getting people their ID cards, they just didn't know how to implement Obamacare. They certainly didn't do it smoothly and effectively. And a number of health plans had problems. You recall back in 2014, the websites crashed and all that. But it was far worse at Blue Shield than for most insurance companies. And then there was also the issue of Blue Shield sent provider directories out to people, and the doctors listed in the provider directories weren't actually in the network, and so people just had a lot of difficulty getting the care that they paid for because they didn't have their medical cards, they didn't have accurate provider directories, and so that's how Blue Shield made this big profit, was basically, you know, basically by making it too difficult for its enrollees to get care, so it makes this huge profit, and then it has to pay this excess profit tax to the government, and it turns around and dings its enrollees for it. And so I wrote about this because that doesn't seem to me to be the sort of thing that any health plan ought to be doing, much less a nonprofit health plan. So,
I think something should be said about what happened when Blue Cross went for profit.
mhm.
There were some individuals that made hundreds of millions of dollars, individuals.
Yeah.
And one would think that there would be laws in place to prevent that from happening again.
Well, there was. It wasn't perfect, and you know, you're talking about the CEO, Leonard Schaefer, who walked away with, yeah, I think it was
200.
hundreds, plural, or 200 or something, but, and that's why the legislature, even though the Department of Corporations did what it could and got the $3 billion for these public benefit foundations, and that was good, but then the next year, the legislature passed this law to provide very, very close scrutiny of those types of situations to avoid even that kind of thing, so that a CEO couldn't make some sweetheart deal, a CEO of a nonprofit, a sweetheart deal with the health plan that's purchasing it. But right now, that doesn't apply to Blue Shield. I mean, nothing to prevent Blue Shield's CEO from saying, you know, going to Aetna or something and saying, hey, buy us, I'll give you a really good price. I know we're worth $10 billion, but you could buy us for $8 billion or $7 billion. That money will then go to Blue Shield's former board of directors. They can decide what to do with it, but in return for giving you a really good deal, I want you to make me CEO of the combined entity. I mean, now I don't know that could necessarily happen, but there are no protections against that sort of thing happening. There's, you know, if Article 11 doesn't apply, and that's what the DMHC director has said, Article 11 doesn't apply, then the DMHC has very limited ability to police that kind of thing.
I just wanted to note, you mentioned lobbying expenditures. In 2015 alone, the parent corporation, you mentioned everybody that calls themselves Blue is part of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. Yeah. That parent organization, just in 2015, and lobbying and donations to Congress critters, $8.13 million. Blue Cross Blue Shield of California.
Well, wait, there isn't a Blue Cross Blue Shield of California. It's Blue Cross.
But this website is just lumping it all together. There is no Blue Cross of California, that's Anthem now.
Right.
But on the line here, I'm just reading, it says Blue Cross Blue Shield of California, only $400,000. Now, these are donations to federal Congress critters.
Right.
I haven't yet found the website that compiles the data for donations and lobbying with our state legislators.
Yeah.
I'm gonna find that one.
But there is,
Haven't seen it
no,
yet.
the Blue Shield plays the, you know, lobbying and campaign contributions game very aggressively. You know, yeah, I think it's, now Kaiser, for example, as a, you know, takes the position that as a nonprofit, it's not appropriate to give campaign contributions to, so Kaiser makes no political contributions.
Yeah, oh, well, I would argue that, because I don't have the statistics in my head, but Proposition 45,
Mhm.
Kaiser.
Can you go back to the microphone? We're
Yeah.
missing all this good information.
Yeah, I have to challenge that, because I know for a fact that Kaiser and Blue Shield were gave a lot of money to defeat Proposition 45, which would have put some controls over the insurance companies.
Yeah, it was a total of $52 million that was donated, and the bulk of it, I think, was Kaiser and
Yeah,
Blue
Kaiser
Cross.
was
No, it's
right at
true.
the top.
10 or 15 million.
Kaiser-
And Blue Shield was pretty high up
Oh,
there
yeah,
too.
yeah, absolutely. You know, Kaiser does give money to ballot initiative campaigns.
Yeah.
Always has, but you know, to me, and you know, I mean, Kaiser has given money to ballot initiative campaigns that we would all support, like for gay rights, and you know, so. I think that's a little different than making campaign contributions to politicians. Because when you're making campaign contributions to politicians, you're buying access, you're buying influence, you're participating in a form of legalized bribery.
Oh, I
All right,
agree.
and
Yes.
I think for a nonprofit that is totally inappropriate. Now, when you're making campaign contributions for a ballot initiative campaign, at least it's kind of out in the open and it's clear you're spending those resources to advance a particular side of an issue, and people can then take you to task and say, look, I mean, a lot of people, I think, would agree that it would be totally appropriate for an organization like Kaiser to support a ballot initiative that raises taxes on cigarettes to pay for health insurance for poor children, right? And so, you know, I wouldn't say that absolutely no nonprofit health plan shouldn't be making any ballot initiative contributions. It depends on what they're for. But they shouldn't be in the game of legalized bribery of politicians.
I got lost back in the 90s. When in the mid-90s, the legislature clarified the status of a nonprofit corporation by the charitable.
Not exactly. What
Well,
the-
there was something
Yeah.
happened then that you said then Blue Shield, to try to protect themselves from that development, created the member, what is it?
the mutual benefit.
Mutual benefit. But that means they had to apply for a different corporate status, did they not?
Well, I wouldn't say apply. Basically, they just go into the Secretary of State's office and they reincorporate it, and there was no review of it. There's no.
Well, that's what I'm asking. How could a nonprofit corporation suddenly go in and file some papers and get themselves radically changed without there being any?
Well, it's still they're still a nonprofit corporation, so they can't go and turn themselves into a for-profit corporation quite so easily. But this is sort of a bridge. You know, they turn themselves into a nonprofit mutual benefit corporation.
Since that meaning was very vague and excluded the public at large,
yeah,
how could that step be just a formality of signing papers?
because that's what it is. I'm not saying that's what it should be, or
Yeah,
there
and
shouldn't
that-
be a review of it, but that's what it is.
Yeah,
I mean, I agree. I think that their incorporation as a mutual benefit corporation was totally inappropriate. And
well, it was qualitatively different than what existed before, is what I'm concerned about. And so.
well, it was, I mean, you know, believe it or not, in what I described to you, I greatly simplified a lot of things. But, you know, Blue Shield, you know, when Blue Shield was formed back in the 30s and the 40s, they didn't have these different kinds of nonprofit corporations. It was just general nonprofit corporation. And they were tax exempt, and that's what Blue Shield was. And then in 1980, they changed the nonprofit corporate law to create these three classes of nonprofit corporations. Public benefit nonprofits, you know, the kinds of nonprofits most of us think of as nonprofits, charities and advocacy organizations and nonprofit hospitals and so forth. mutual benefit corporations and religious corporations. That change was made in the 80s, where they divided, but they didn't say, okay, all nonprofit corporations, you now have to reincorporate yourself into one of these three categories. And what's interesting is, because Blue Shield now says, well, we had to change from general to one of these three, and mutual benefits seemed to us to be the one that most closely fit what we were. Well, A, that doesn't, very closely fit what you were. And B, why did you wait until 1994 or 95 to do that, right? The law was changed in 1980, and you were perfectly happy to operate as a general nonprofit corporation. But then in 1985, just as soon as the legislature starts considering this law, then you cook up this scheme. You're gonna become a mutual benefit corporation, and then go to the legislature and ask for an exemption from the law for mutual benefit corporations. So
Well, yeah, this is what
okay,
all right.
Again, I mean, I'm just, that's what happened. It's outrageous.
Okay.
It wasn't, clearly against the law. But the protection on all of that, again, was the common law, which says, we don't care how you've organized yourself. If you've taken in money, either by contributions or selling products, promising to do good for the public, that money you've taken in belongs to the public. It's held in trust for the public. And we don't care whether you're a for-profit company or a nonprofit, whatever you are. If that's basically the deal you made when you took in that money doesn't belong to you. It has to be used for the purposes, has to be used in accordance with the promises you made when you took that money in. And Blue Shield, by going out there, advertising to the world, if you go on Facebook or Twitter, Blue Shield describes itself as for community, not for profit. Okay, and I mean so it is. That's what it's telling people. You buy insurance from us. This organization is all about serving the community. Under the charitable trust law, it has an obligation to serve the community with the money it takes in. And so I think the law is pretty clear. I just think that the Department of Managed Healthcare has failed to apply the law to Blue Shield and kind of given them a pass.
But the switch to the mutual benefit concept abandoned the original one. It wasn't just a change of words, it was a change of concept.
I know, but what I'm saying is, even though they did that, they still had a charitable trust obligation. And I would argue they still have a charitable trust obligation, so that they shouldn't have been allowed to do that, because by doing that, they were able to not, they were able to operate with a stunning lack of transparency, and there are all kinds of other issues, but we still have laws in place that protect the public's interest in the assets of a nonprofit, even when something like that happens. And that has failed because the Department of Managed Healthcare, the director of the Department of Managed Healthcare, has failed to apply the law there. That's where we've got to break down now.
Michael, I have a question about, is there currently any talk about, or are there any mergers, consolidations, acquisitions on the table for Blue Shield at this time? And if not, you have any idea, like, what are chances that they will engage in this, as they are not one of the larger medical industrial complex institutions? So
yeah, I mean, they're not. They will tell you that we're a nonprofit. We plan to be nonprofit for the rest of existence, and et cetera. And so they certainly don't have any publicly announced deals, but again, I don't think they would have kind of maneuvered in the way that they have maneuvered if they weren't really interested in making sure that they could go out there and sell themselves to a for-profit and not have to give up their assets, the $10 billion to the public. And, like I say, given the industry dynamics, given kind of what's happening in the health, see, what's happening with health insurance these days is becoming much more focused on information technology. That's the real value that insurance companies have to provide. It isn't, it used to be an insurance company could make a lot of money because it was better at judging the risks of the people that it was insuring, and it knew, okay, we can charge that person a really low premium, but they're going to be really healthy, and so we're going to make money off of them. And they had, you know, if a company had a better capability to do that than another health insurance company, it could make a lot of money. That's all gone now, because under Obamacare they have to cover everybody regardless of health status. They can't vary premiums based on health status. But now what insurance companies, the value that they can provide, particularly with large employers, is they have all sorts of data they can share with those large employers about their members and about which members are the healthiest ones and whether or not their members in a certain location are healthier than employees in a different location, and so then the company can take out the soda vending machines in this other location. But so it's all about information technology and IT is something where economies of scale really matter. Blue Shield can't build. It's got 4 million members. And even as big and as an organization as it is, it can't afford to build as sophisticated an IT system as Anthem can, with its 20+ million members. And after it buys Cigna, 40 million members. And so, so Blue Shield, like I say, I think there's going to be real pressure on Blue Shield to get bigger. And the way to get bigger is going to be gobbled up by some for-profit health plan. And when that happens, we want to make sure that the money that's paid for Blue Shield goes to the public and not into private hands.
Hi. I have a silly question.
Sure.
So, are you saying that Blue Shield could sell itself to a bigger entity?
Yep.
So if that happens, there's a profit, right?
Right.
Who gets those profits?
But that's what I'm saying is that those profits should go, and those profits are $10 billion, what Blue
Right.
Shield is worth, something on that order, should go to the public, into a public
But
benefit
it's not going to the
foundation.
public, right?
But that's not what would happen given,
So
given
therefore,
their.
the board of directors keep the profits
Well,
for
that's
themselves?
a big question. Is the law is kind of silent about that. It would just go to the board of directors. They would continue to have this mutual benefit corporation. It would no longer, they would have sold off their biggest asset or their only asset, Blue Shield, but the nonprofit corporation would still exist. They would have this board of directors. They would have this $10 billion. They have no members. What can they do with that money? I don't know. Could they decide, you know what? We're a mutual benefit corporation. We're now going to become a big fancy country club with 11
Right,
members.
so therefore they can do with the money what they will, right, basically?
It's, whether or not they could literally run off with that money, personally stick it in their pockets, I don't know. I would imagine that if they tried to do that, there would be such a hue and cry about it, and the legislature would step in, and as a practical matter, it would be probably difficult for them to do, but they would have control of it.
Right.
And what's clear to me, though, is it would not go to the public for community benefit, to serve community
So
benefit
therefore, can board of
healthcare
directors
use.
decide to invest it in a movie theater, a very fancy movie theater if they want?
I mean, I don't see anything in the law that would prevent them from
Right.
doing that. Like I said, they could turn it all into a big country club, which are
Exactly.
mutual benefit corporations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
They did, by the way, around the time that Proposition 45 was up, they did go and buy a stadium, what's it called?
They bought a box.
They
Yeah,
bought a
luxury
whole,
box.
you know, big luxury box, and and Consumer Watchdog got wind of that.
Mhm.
And so they had Blue Shield members asking for tickets.
Yeah.
They said, wait a minute, who's this for? They said,
Mhm.
it's for members. And they said, we're members, we want tickets. And they had a
Right. Yeah, no.
Public
rally.
protest.
I
They
mean,
had a
it's-
public protest. So that's just, frankly, that's an example of how
Yeah.
they will spend the money.
Maybe they'll buy a whole stadium. Several
Are there
whole
other
stadiums.
questions or comments? I can bring the mic to you. No?
Let the poor man go home.
Okay. I was just gonna say, this sort of smacks of kind of a little study, a microcosmic study of what might explain how we live in a world where 67 people own the collective wealth of 3.5 billion people at the bottom.
Mhm.
That is the world that we're living in, and we know that those people, the 67 people, were not earning an hourly wage to make the wealth of 3.5 billion of the world's poorest people. So, anyway,
They're earning a secondly wage.
yes, a secondly wage. And we really appreciate you coming.
Thank you
you
for having me.
so much. And I want to remind people again to go to the website, makeitRightBlueShield.org. Please sign the petition, send it to your friends, and read some of the blogs, because there is much, much more than was discussed here today, because this was a complex topic. I personally appreciate the fact that you made it intelligible for me, because I'm not a numbers person, but you really made it make sense. A situation that shouldn't make sense, of course, because it shouldn't exist, but anyway, made it make sense. And you are a hero, and that will not change. Whatever else happens, you are. And I know that I appreciate you, and I'm sure many, many more people, everyone in this room, and many, many more people, as they learn of your quest to make it right, Blue Shield, will appreciate you and honor the fact that you've really put your all, your humanity into trying to make this a better world for all of us. And you certainly deserve our appreciation. I forgot to ask, did you have any other words you wanted to say?
No,
That's it. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.